Welcome on behalf of Nicholls Art Group and the First Freedom Art. I would like to say this is such a privilege to have these marvellous friends here that are so renowned in their sphere. And especially it's hosted this afternoon by Dr Alison Smith, who I honestly call her, all my years of interviewing and things like that, is the renowned curator in the world to me. She's extraordinary. And she was formerly the curator of the National Portrait Gallery, went to the Wallace Collection, and before that again was at the Tate, a marvellous background, and she's hosting this afternoon. Would you please put your hands together and give a great welcome to Dr. Alison Smith.
It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon for this In Conversation. It's going to be a very informal, lively In Conversation about the art of portraiture and what makes it so unique and special. And I'm joined by three really distinguished portrait painters who have all made their mark in very different ways. What connects them all is their belief in direct observation, looking direct from the subject. But their painting styles, as you will see, are very distinct, very different. So I was going to introduce the artists. So we have at the end Frances Bell, who works in this wonderful sort of fluid way, and her art is based on the connection between the sitter, the artist and the sitter. That relationship is really key to her work, which she sort of draws with paint in this very sort of fluid manner, connecting the sitter with the background. And she has exhibited widely and has been the recipient of many awards, most recently the Draper Grand Prize for the Portrait Society of America last year. So that's Frances. Then we have Antony Williams, whose work is quite different. He's very unusual and he works with egg tempera. Those who have been to the National Gallery up the road will have seen the early Italian paintings of Piero della Francesca, of those wonderful artists who worked in tempera. Tempera is fast drying, requires great skill and expertise, but Antony works close up and he sort of builds up the face on what the hair, the textures, very slowly using these intricate lines, almost like a spider's web. Very interested in the surface, but there's also a psychological aspect to his work as well. And then finally we have Miriam Escofet, who was born in Barcelona, from Spain, came here as a teenager, and her work is similar to both in a way. It's hyper-realistic, you might say, like Antony's. They're all interested in this idea of realism, and truth, how have you defined that? But there's something strange about Miriam's work, like Antony's. And I think this is perhaps to do with her Spanish heritage, interest in allegory and symbolism. Anyway, there's a lot to discover, as you shall see. So that's a very brief overview of our three artists. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of their specialisms is portraiture. Now, portraiture is the most problematic of all the genres. It presents a challenge to the artist, and artists in the past, as they are today, can often be frustrated with portraiture, because a portrait is first and foremost a likeness. Now, I used to work at the National Portrait Gallery at the Road, and if you go into the permanent collection and look at the labels, you will see the sitter is mentioned before the artist. The idea the sitter is most important. Then you have the artistry involved in creating that image. Now that can be, I'm going to ask all the participants what their thoughts about that. That's because the Portrait Gallery obviously is a gallery of British history, culture and society. But for the artist, they are always somehow restricted by this idea of authenticity or the likeness, because the audience expects the portrait to be a representation of someone. But at the same time, the artist is using pigment. They're using pencil, they're using the media. They're fascinated by the material qualities of the pigment itself. And that can, there's a tension there. And I'd just like to ask all our participants what they make of that tension. Is it something they find exciting and inspiring or frustrating? So perhaps I'll start off with Miriam.
Hi, yes. I mean, I agree with all of that, of course. I think there is a tension in portraiture. I mean, for me personally, a portrait, first and foremost, has to work as a painting. So yes, it's a portrait, but it is a painting. So the kind of concerns that I would have about a still life painting or even a landscape painting, I mean, I painted a lot of still lifes before I arrived at portraiture. And so I think I bring a lot of those concerns into my portraiture work. And I think that, I know it's something we'll discuss as the conversation goes on, but I think that's why a lot of portrait artists like to paint personal works, because with a personal work you can be a lot freer, you can explore more ideas, you're not so beholden to deliver a sense of the persona in the finished work. And yes, you're very aware that a lot of the audience will look at portraiture with quite a superficial eye, because most people will be concerned with the likeness. And in a sense, the slightly autobiographical thing that you get, or sort of self-portrait thing that you get, you know, people relate to portraits on a kind of personal level. But as a painter, you're obviously concerned with other things. So, but I think any painter in any field would have these same sort of problematic ideas that the most of the audience don't really get what they're trying to do. You know, I think it's a very personal journey, but you're using sometimes a very public figure as the vehicle to achieve what you are interested in a painterly way as an artist.
Antony, what do you think?
Well, I sort of concur with a lot of what Miriam has said. But for me, sometimes there's a division between obviously the personal work and commission work. So the personal work, yes, it doesn't. If I'm working from a model, it doesn't really matter whether it looks like them or not, really. Although I do always strive to get a likeness, I think, because I feel that if there's no likeness, it's not really working as a painting. But I still feel that primarily it has to work as a painting. Likeness is secondary. It's always secondary. But there is this tension. There's always this tension, especially if it's a commission, and it's sort of got to look like the person you're painting. But for me, even if it looks like them and it's not a good painting, as a painting, it doesn't work. I'm not happy with it. So even if it's a good likeness, but it doesn't work on that as a painting, well, on any kind of significant level, it's just not really satisfying for me. So it has to be a painting foremost. So yeah, that's really my take on it. Yeah.
I agree with both of you, but I actually love the interaction with my sitters. So I view them as collaborators, and sometimes there are tensions, especially around likeness. It's usually expression, the native expressions of a person that make them seem to their friends and family, or their institution even, sort of real and lifelike. But I actually find that your sitters, and most of all your sitters' relations, can really help you. They're expert witnesses to this particular process, and you can find out fascinating things about how, say, a person is viewed when they're not sitting quietly with you in a studio. From other people, they will tell you, and that's really interesting. So you sort of fold in, because I have my sittings, and they're quite organic. The process is quite messy. There's paint everywhere. You can start to get a feel through the sitter of what might be a kind of capital T truth for them, and that all gets sort of folded in. But it's definitely the case that there comes a point where you frankly need to unspool a bit and do one of your own. And in that situation, you're best to consult nobody but yourself and just have your own time. But I would be wrong to say that I feel the tension. I think it's mostly collaborative. It doesn't bother me per se. Of course, there are little moments, but I quite like having other people involved in my process. For mostly the commissions, but actually in general, I even ask other people sometimes when I'm just working away on my own things. So, yeah, I quite like visitors into my painting life, briefly.
That's an interesting comment, because obviously you're making the point that portraiture is a very social art form. It's a sort of three-way process. You've got a sort of connection between the artist, the subject, the sitter. Then there's also the spectator who looks at the work. and interprets it in his or her own way. So this is, I think, another thing I want to mention about portraiture, having tried it myself, I think there's a sort of magic attached to it as well. And this is part of the creative process. I'm sure you all three feel this. Somewhere during the drawing or the painting, you might feel it come alive. You might feel the person come alive before you. And that's what I think makes it so special. There is this sort of human presence sort of taking form in front of you, and you are a kind of Pygmalion figure, giving sort of new birth to that. So I think this is really what's so fascinating about portraiture, and it brings us on to the idea of the psychology. You're not just, the artist not just representing the surface, the externals. You're a really skilled artist can get what Ruth said, behind the mask, into the inner world of the sitter. And the subject, the sitter, might not always like that. This is the other thing about portraiture. Sometimes the artist may think this is a wonderful portrait, but the sitter might say, oh, this is awful, this is not how I see myself. Or the audience might say, that's not how I imagine that person to be, particularly someone in the public eye. So there are lots of issues surrounding portraiture. We're going to delve a little bit deeper now, and each artist is going to have the opportunity to talk about their own work, the creative process, what they're seeking to achieve through a portrait, how they develop a portrait, the difference between private works, i.e. works they undertake on their own initiative, and portraits undertaken as commissions. So we're going to start off with Miriam. You're going to just give us a sort of whiz through some of the highlights of your career.
Can you see?
Can you all see? So
I can see. Yes. Yes. So that the work that's on the screen is a very good piece to start on, really. So that's a kind of extreme cases of a very personal work in terms of portraiture, and it was a portrait of my mother. And I'd had her in mind to paint for some time, but I was just looking for a context. I'm very concerned with composition in my paintings, in my portraits. And in a sense, I love to bring in the kind of symbology of objects into my work when I can. And then anyway, at some point it just dawned on me in a very simple way that actually I should paint her at the kitchen table, because that was her realm, really. And she would literally, my best moments spent with her were endless conversations around the kitchen table. So the work that you see on the left is a pastel study that started off quite simply and then evolved into this very, very highly worked, which is what I tend to do when I draw. I tend to kind of take drawings to a very high developed stage. And that was a pastel study with her kind of tea crockery and this kind of slightly mysterious Victory of Samothrace or Nike figure on this sort of little chalice thing. And then I wanted to develop that into an oil painting, and it suddenly dawned on me that the objects carried a lot of symbolism. So I wanted to play around with that, so that you see this kind of perspectival. I love playing around with perspective, and I love drawing. So I tried to work that into my working process as much as I can as a sort of self-indulgence. But I sort of moved the object around to fit the final oil painting. So that's the oil painting, which is about twice the size of the pastel, and some of the objects have moved a little bit, and they're almost taking up, I think, more presence in the painting as well.
Yes, can you point to the revolving plate?
Yes. So and as I was painting the painting, I realised it was one of these paintings. It takes me forever to paint a painting. I have a very slow, highly detailed process. I literally spend months on each piece. So it gives me a lot of time, in a sense, to develop a relationship with the work and to understand what I'm really trying to do with it. And at some point I realised that it was very much painting about time, and the sense of awareness of that. Actually, I had very little time left with my mother because of the age that she was. She was in her sort of early to mid-80s then. And so I wanted to get the sense of time into the painting. So some of the objects are moving. So the plate has moved. The angel figure has got a sort of blur to it, suggesting that it would have moved. It was a very bold thing for me to do because I'm a slightly hyper-realist painter. So I thought, gosh, this is either going to be a disaster and I'm going to fall flat on my face, or it's going to work. And then this is the work that went on to win the VP Portrait Award. So for me, on a personal level, that was a real validation that actually sometimes when you put your most personal ideas into a work and you take them to a slightly weird, but to you very meaningful place, that the audience really resonates with that. So it was that was my kind of take home, note to self with that work.
Can I just ask you a quick question about it? It's almost like a grisaille. It's not quite grisaille.
It is.
Grisaille means monochrome.
Yeah.
There's a lot of colour in it, but it's very subdued, isn't it?
It's very intentionally monochromatic because
Yes.
I wanted to just focus on the light, and it's actually a very busy painting. There's a lot going on, and the thing that saves it from being hyper busy is the monochromatic palette. So that gives it a sense of serenity, which I wanted the work to have. So yeah, the colour palette is obviously a very important decision in painting. And also, if you edit out colour, you solve a lot of problems in painting, actually. Colour can be your friend and it can be your enemy as well, And I'm more interested in volume, if I'm honest. So I love colour, but so it was about the sense of volume and space in the painting and the sense of time, yeah.
Interesting. Do you want to show something which is quite different?
So I've now evolved this process where this was a commissioned portrait of Professor Mark Welland for St Catherine's College in Cambridge. And he's somebody who came with a lot of ideas. He's somebody who was very, like a lot of masters of colleges, they're quite resistant to the idea of having their portrait painted because these are very kind of intellectual, cerebral people. They're not really huge egos, they're not VIPs in that sense. But at some point they have to have their portraits painted. They all dread it. So he was very particular that he wanted me to paint his portrait, and he came with a lot of ideas to the table, which is great. And sort of echoing what Francis was saying earlier, that's where the collaborative thing really comes in. I love sitters that come with ideas, especially obviously if they chime with your kind of philosophy and your aesthetic of painting. So he wanted very much his family to be part of the portrait, which is not what you do with a master's portrait. So we had to find a way of engineering that into the painting. So I suggested the idea of a mirror that reflected an aspect of the room that in a sense is happening behind me, that's being reflected in the painting. And I was obviously had in mind, I had in mind Velázquez's Las Meninas, and not that no one's ever going to come close to that, but Vermeer, this idea of a painting within a painting or a reflected area in a painting is something that I wanted to play around with. So when it's a commissioned portrait for me, I present these very worked up layout drawings because I think it's nice for the sitter or the client to have an idea of where the work is going, and also for myself because I work in this very precise, layered way. I can change aspects of the composition, but I don't want to be making the composition up as I go along. I need to have a clear sense of composition, and then in a sense, the rest of the painting process is really a process of crafting that to my kind of end vision, but always slightly consciously leaving a few gaps open where things can intervene, because I think the element of intervention, unexpected intervention in a painting is quite important. So this was also commissioned, but for a private family. So it's a very private commission. So it has a different. So there were all sorts of elements that the Mark Welland portrait required, sort of nods to his kind of career achievements and whatever. This is a portrait of which was a very young little girl, glorious sort of looking thing, who had this complete. I think children are wonderful because they have this, in a sense, magical connection to the world around. Every aspect of the world is open to magic in their imagination. I think that's a very interesting thing. And actually, I think it's something that artists tap into very easily because I think, especially me, I can only speak for myself, but I think that sense of almost animism or the sense that objects can carry magic or symbolism, it, for me, is something that I remain open to all the time because that's the language I use in my work. So I find children's imagination really fascinating because it kind of correlates with that. So she loved little insects and creatures and flowers kind of obsessively. So these were two layout drawings that I presented for the final work. And so the final image was halfway between the two drawings. So this is actually quite a small, intimate. So yeah, this is the kind of commission where, of course, you're aware that that the client has an idea of what they want you to do, but I had complete open canvas for that. They just wanted whatever I would deliver, in a sense.
Fascinating.
And then-
Shall we just finish up by
Yes.
going to one
Should we go to the, yes, so
of the
this,
late Queen?
yes, so this was, I was commissioned to paint a portrait of the Queen for the Foreign Office in 2019. And so it's a very late stage portrait of the Queen, and I think in fact it turned out to be the last official portrait of the Queen, because I did this literally just before we went into lockdown. I had my sittings just before we went into lockdown, and then I painted this portrait in glorious isolation, just me in my studio with the Queen for all the period of lockdown. So in a sense, the timing for me was perfect, because it just allowed me to concentrate completely. But I mean, this is obviously interesting because as an artist, in a sense, it doesn't get better to be asked to paint the Queen, but it's a real double-edged sword, because you are painting, at that time, possibly the most famous person in the world. So as an artist, you're always very keen, as Alison said, to get the psychology and the sense of truth about the person, which for me, there's always a lot of vulnerability revealed in that. I think to capture the essence of somebody, there's a lot of vulnerability in all of us, and most of us adopt a bit of a mask to face the world, because we like to be seen as confident and, you know, the best version of ourselves. But actually, all of us carry a shadow side and a lot of fears and vulnerability. So as a portrait artist, you're looking for those things that actually give the clue to the character. But obviously when you're painting the Queen, you're very aware that the public expect to see the persona, who's the Queen. So there's the person and the persona. And you're treading, so I mean, it was almost a slightly schizophrenic process in the portrait, because you're kind of going from one camp to the other. You're trying to incorporate both things, which are actually sort of incompatible in a way, but that's what you're trying to get into the painting at the same time. So yes, it's you have a very complicated relationship with that kind of portrait, really, and you almost can't look at it objectively afterwards, because in a sense you make all sorts of compromises that you don't make with other paintings because of who you're painting. But at the same time, it's a gift, you know. So it's
It's your symbol, a figurehead.
Yes.
At the same time, a real human
Exactly,
being.
exactly.
And Antony, you also did a portrait of the Queen as well, which you'll come on to, I think, in a moment. So should we move on to look at, and that's fascinating, and we're going to come back to many of the points you've raised, but let's come on to Antony.
So my technique is very different to Miriam and Francis, because I work in egg tempera, which is basically, instead of using oil as your binder, you're using egg yolk, which is an early Renaissance medium, and it precedes oil painting, really. And so for some reason, I decided to take it up about 30 or 35 years ago, and I'd been working for a picture restorer, and this chap was also an artist, and he introduced me to this medium as he sketched in it. He used it for sketching outside on plein air, and I sort of took to it slowly. So it just ran alongside oil painting at that time as well, and I just became more intrigued about it as a medium, and I started going to the National Gallery, the Sainsbury Wing, and looking at the early Italian paintings by Piero della Francesca and Bellini, you know, and there's just something about the purity and the clarity of the work that was produced with tempera, which really resonated with me. And a lot of my work is based on drawing. So when I start a painting, I will do a very finished preliminary kind of study in pencil or charcoal, and when I do paint with tempera, it is almost a continuation of that process, because it is like drawing almost, because you're applying small strokes of paint, which is similar to working with pencil almost, and it's a building up process. So this is sort of, I've had a number of sittings here with this chap called Andrew, and if you look at the background, the hair and the shoulder, that is the underpainting, and the whole of the image would have started off like that. So I do quite a number of layers as I work into the painting. So I do quite a lot of work from the drawing I've done of my sitter. So I have the sitter in for a few sessions, and have this drawing which I transfer onto a panel, a gesso panel, and then I start a preliminary, I start painting in tempera and do an underpainting in tempera, and where the flesh tones are would be there'll be an underpainting of terre verte with white, so which is the Renaissance technique of painting. And over that, I would apply the warmer tones. So I'm working kind of cool colours off warm colours. And so it's a process. And it can take many months to actually produce one of these paintings. Even a modest panel can take.
Would you say that sort of the face is the excuse for painting? Because I noticed you drew a lot of portraits close up.
Yeah.
So you're really interested in sort of the texture.
I am.
There's this wonderful sort of furrow mark.
Yeah, well,
it seems like a stone
when I was
or something.
absolutely. I am attracted to all the kind of. It's more like a cartographer's kind of map.
Yes.
So I work from detail to detail basically. So it's like joining the sort of marks or the dots or the lines. So and it's like a miniaturist technique almost, but on a larger sort of scale. And I was attracted to Andrew because he had a very interesting face. He had a dent in his forehead, and he actually suffered from a condition. I won't go into all the details, but during his life he's had quite a lot of surgery to remove bits of his head, really, and face. So, but he was an interesting character, and that's what So often it's something about someone that sort of draws me in. But that was not a commission. That was. So he agreed to sit for me. He wanted to sit for me. So, and it didn't have to be a likeness. I had carte blanche to do whatever I liked, really, which is great. Which is my kind of preferred way of working. Although I'm happy to work to commission as well. So.
Should we get some other works?
Yeah. Let's go. Yeah.
Let's see where we end up.
So that's not a commission as well. That's another work but incorporating a still life element. So I try to get some kind of I don't know how you actually produce sort of psychological impact into a painting, or how do you create that in a painting. It's somehow maybe the tension between objects or their expression or what. I don't really know.
There's the textures as well as
and the textures.
Then there's sort of the fur of the coat, and then has all the distant gaze.
Yeah.
Reminds me of Lucian Freud's work.
Well, there is, I mean, I do owe a debt to Freud, especially early on in my career, and I was very, influenced by Freud, I suppose. Especially about, his paintings above other people's work had that kind of psychological insight into the sitter, and they're quite strange as well. And that's what stayed with me. Although I work in a different technique, I have a different medium, so I didn't want to become a Freud kind of copyist, or I wanted to be my own art person. But
is there the sense of sort of existential isolation at the same time as a sort of warmth and a humanity?
Yeah, which I
think is different from Freud.
Yeah, and I like that in other artists. The other artists I look at, I tend to gravitate towards artists who have that element in their work. I'm trying to think of somebody else now, but sort of isolation, maybe sort of Edward Hopper even.
But
also
Andrew Wyeth.
Andrew Wyeth, yes, Andrew Wyeth, definitely Andrew Wyeth. Yeah, so who's a great tempera painter. So and I've always been interested in texture as well. So tempera is very good at creating texture. So the texture of the cactus and the coat, and that sort of kind of a look of it could of a worldliness maybe of the sitter. So is she really what is she thinking about or not thinking about? So yeah.
How long does it take you to do one of these portraits?
Well, usually I master that quite a lot. I never really know how to answer because I usually have about 4 or 5 paintings on the go at the same time, like lots of artists, and I can never really. It's really small a long time because I'm using small brushes, small sable brushes, like 3040 brushes, and it's like a pointillist technique. So I'm building up touch, stroke after stroke, and it's not really the ideal medium for portraits in a sense because it requires so much time, and you need the sitter to be there for such a long time. And working in oils is so much easier in a way.
Just a very quick question, which I think would be interesting to all feed into this. Do you use digital media, or are you working directly from the subject? These are directly from the subject. You won't revert to rely on photographs at all?
Well, sometimes I use, but it depends on what I'm. Ideally, I would just work all from the subject, but it's not always possible, especially with a commission. You know, you might only have one sitting or two sittings, so it's impossible. So I have mixed feelings about it actually, but it's always it's like a moral kind of internal debate. But they can be helpful actually. It can be helpful, and there's some great paintings, some great artists use purely photography. So I don't stand. I'm not a purist at all really on that subject. Yeah. So,
Can you put another
Yeah.
work or two just to see where we go? Do you want to look at this one of
yeah, do the Queen. Let's do the Queen.
that was quite controversial. Wasn't
Yeah. There she is.
Yes.
So yeah, it was when I painted this quite a long time ago. So 1995, and it was it was actually part of a competition I won called the Ondaatje Prize, and in that year, that year only actually, it was a commission in the form of a commission, not just a cash prize. So I actually had to produce a portrait of someone, and it was only announced when I was awarded the prize that it was going to be the Queen. And for me, and for me, I was only like 30 then, 31 or whatever, and it was quite early on in my career to get a commission like that. It was quite, because I'd only painted a bishop before then. So, and that's like my second I'd only done two free commissions before then, and then he landed with that. So it was quite a big thing, and I had to wait 4 months to actually have my first sitting. From hearing about it in May, I had to wait until September really to have the first sitting at Buckingham Palace. And so it was quite a long lead-in, so actually before I had my first sitting, I actually met the Queen's dresser to decide on what she was going to wear actually. So I also looked at all the previous portraits, and I think I went for this because I wanted to. Obviously, you're painting the Queen, but I didn't want to overwhelm it with all the regalia of the institution. So I wanted it to be quite pared down. So I did make a conscious decision about focusing just on her as a person, almost, and not the institution. But obviously, you can't get away from that. But that was my feelings at the time. I don't know if I would do it differently now. It was quite early on, and it was. So I had 7 sittings for that, which was great. I had 7 2-hour sittings, which is a luxury compared to what. You only have one.
I had 2.
Two, yeah. So it was a huge privilege to have that, to be with the Queen and actually to work with her there. And it turned out to be quite a controversial painting when it was unveiled.
Can you say why?
Well, some of the critics took issue with certain. Well, I think it was the realism of the painting. They felt it was too kind of warts and all, too much detail. I'd made it look older. And Brian Sewell, who was the art critic for the Standard, I remember seeing him here writing notes, and somebody wanted to introduce me to him, and he wouldn't talk to me. Because he was going to write this very vitriolic piece in the Standard that evening, and it was, yeah. And he referred to her. I love his quotes are amazing. And he referred to her as an old age pensioner about to lose her bungalow, or my depiction of her. So that was yeah. But it's good. It's all good.
That's a wonderful portrait, actually. I think it has no. It's very sympathetic, it doesn't. But it's a human being at the same time. I think you were talking about vulnerability, and that really comes across in the portrait of Pat Nicholls.
She'd had quite a problematic year before that, with the fire at Windsor Castle, and there were other elements, going on in the dynamic of the royal family. So it was a difficult, period.
Yes, you compare with the Friberg painting behind us, on 1990.
I know, it seems like a halcyon kind of period.
It works very well in
It does. I mean, yeah, things haven't got better really. Anyway, so, yeah.
No, fascinating. So let's move on to Frances now. Is that okay? Here.
Yeah.
Well, yes, Dr. Dick.
We can start with her.
Yes, perfect, wonderful.
Okay. So, Cressida was painted for the Met whilst she was commissioner in 2001. 19 to celebrate 100 years of women being allowed in the Met. And it was the classic institutional portrait. Tight brief, loads of predecessors to guide you, please stay within these lines. The only option she really had, the choice she had, was how formal or how informal, and how to reference London. And we had a choice of maps. Some of them were alarming primary colours everywhere, and then there was the sort of the OS map. And so it's a perfect example of having to slalom your way through preordained things that you must honour. And so that is the official portrait, but she has actually sat for me again since. At a later date, 3 years ago, she came to sit for me really as part of a totally separate set of arrangements with her partner, who was a keen sculptor. We went to a sculpture studio, she's a friend of mine, and I was able to do something completely different. So compare and contrast is the point there. Maybe I should go to Miriam.
Yes. Oh, wait, just before we leave Cressida Dick, was this painted before or after the furore surrounding the corruption in the Met?
It was kicking off around then,
Yes.
but before the sort of major things. Yeah. So, I mean, I think she's great, but it definitely carried an enormous weight, and to watch her have the portrait. Normally they're painted like so many people at the end of your time. But she was in the middle to meet this rather important anniversary date of a centenary of women and pleas, so she was sort of shuffled forward. So yeah, I kind of entered her world as she was probably one of the busiest people in the country, and she was incredibly generous with me, gave me loads of herself for it.
It's quite interesting in terms of the image it projects and what is asked of the portrait artist. So obviously, the vulnerability, there's none of that there. She's shown as a sort of confident woman, isn't she, really?
She is.
Top of her profession.
But we did talk about it. I mean, you hunt around for, within those parameters, you do have some scope. And again, I have sittings to begin with, so I watched her. How does she behave? How does she move around? I'm a great believer in body language. And she is a hands-on hips person. She's very little. So she projects more of herself by putting her hands on her hips. And it's interesting because where it is now, it's at Hendon where they train police officers, and apparently all the young female cadets go underneath. Which in a weird way was probably the point, to empower.
So the painting is now where?
They all are at Hendon where they train.
Yes,
where they train. The Met. So yeah, they're all slightly propaganda of course, but within the context, she is by far of the commissioners painted the most informal, and that was her choice. That was her thing, where she was going to have that. So we were able to move that into a priority position. So no coat, basically, no hat.
Yes.
Yeah.
You want to show the one of Miriam?
Yes. Because it's a bit about a process, and I think
This is fascinating. Let's try and make sure we can...
There's a black screen, which is the video, and it might be...
That's the portrait first.
That's the finished one, okay.
Yes, can you recognise Miriam? Yes, so it's an artist's portrait. There's a whole interesting genre within portraiture of artist portrait, friendship portraits.
Yes, absolutely. And I think in this case, another artist's art and their artistic language coming into your artistic world, like Russian dolls, suddenly you're kind of looking at other elements that are another person's artistic language. Is quite funny. How do you pick that up? And in Miriam's case, the sense of still life and the placement of objects and symbols was obvious. I had to have something. And so the star, is it a star? It was made by you, and so you brought that up to Northumberland with you. And if there is a video, I can show...
Just before you move on to the video, I love the blue of the star.
Yeah.
I think it's quite odd. That could almost be an abstract composition if you shut your eyes, because the blue stands out like a blue square against that base of subtle green.
Yeah, so
and the cool overtones. It's a very bold gesture to make in what is a very...
And what's interesting for me is to see the elements, because obviously that was me, a shirt that I've worn many times, a star. And it's interesting to see which elements you've exaggerated and which colours you've brought forth, and which so the star was actually quite
Yes,
pale.
pale. Yeah.
So that's interesting, the kind of choices of colour and punchiness that
Well,
Francis has introduced.
You were talking about monochrome paintings.
Yeah.
It's very limited, and so one colour element, and there's a famous rule of thumb: never go near blue, because it's a weak wavelength and it won't pop, won't carry. And so I thought, why don't I go near blue? See if I can make some sense of it. It's slightly overcoloured on the screen, but it's quite mute. It's very passive. And I was definitely thinking about your mum's painting. You don't know Iwa, but you're sort of mulling over other people's work. You're kind of living, as they say, rent-free in my head when I'm painting it. The video shows that I had a major change of heart. With Miriam and the sense of the symbolic, almost kind of sacral gesture that Miriam loves, I was going to have the star level with her head, but I'd like to see, but it started fighting with her head, and really I wanted the focus not to be split between head and star. And so at a certain point, this is how I begin. I begin with a mud pie, I fling paint round, it's fairly decent mayhem. The layers then go from something like that through more and more refined versions, and you're just piling oil paint over oil paint over oil paint. And this is my change of plan, which is where the star comes down to where it ends up. But my technique allows me, and it's very important to me, to be able to do a complete U-turn at any point and completely reimagine my thoughts. And so I do that often. I'm frequently changing background colour, reversing out of a cul-de-sac I found myself in and trying something else. And in this case, the major change was compositional. It brought the hand frighteningly close to the bottom of the canvas, but I just decided to pull the arm right out and leave it there. Sort of steer into the skin.
That's wonderful, putting the background. It really makes the changes the face, isn't it?
Yeah, I just felt that it was too similar to the top. And Miriam's, again, finding psychology. Psychology lives in hands a lot, in my view. So you have to hunt down gesture, which is just, it's a vital part of how people present, really. And so I was looking for, it did become more and more somber. I texted Miriam at some point and said, you know, your levity and your lightheartedness and your joy, none of that is in this painting. It's an incredibly, but I think it was your mum's painting. I was being steered by the kind of poetic sadness of that painting. But you kind of get there retrospectively. Sometimes you don't know what you're doing. So that's Miriam. Can't remember. Oh yes, and there's Mark. This was for Cambridge College. He is a fantastically sweet, kind, and wonderful man who won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. And my task again was to try and fit the Nobel Prize into this composition. Unfortunately, the molecule he discovered, which is represented by about this much Lego of kind of every primary colour, and they're very strict on size. These colleges have this much space on the wall, and that's what you get. And I just said, I'm not feeling it. How am I going to get that in? So this is the benefit of the sittings. As he was talking to me, as I was sitting and making my quite vague beginnings, he said about the day that he won the prize. He was very determined not to hang around by the phone. He had known other people who had expected to win it and didn't, and he felt very strongly that he just needed not to be in the house waiting for a call, even though it was, I think, obvious that it would be his. So he went out and pruned apple trees in the garden. Pre-mobile phones, so he really wasn't there. They were ringing, and he wasn't there. And the reason I loved that was because his molecule, when he's explaining it to laymen, he said, they're trees. Think of them as trees, or lollipops. Circles, cone at the bottom. And I thought, that's perfect. You disappear into your own metaphor to avoid winning the Nobel Prize. So we ended up with a mixture of naturalism and symbolism. The lollipop is there, and the apples are there, and he is there, and thereby I evaded the Lego. But for me it's important that in the end there's enough space around the head that the portrait does your work. I'm a naturalist for portraiture most of all, so I want the portrait to be the prime focus. Same with Miriam, moving things so that the portrait sits atop the pile of focus. So that's Sir John Walker, he's called. I think the other one is my daughter, but we don't know where we are on time.
I think we're going to stop actually in a second. Just show the picture of your daughter Flora.
Flora.
That wonderful yellow. So you
Yeah.
love these sort of patches of brilliant colour. Which really animate the paintings.
Yeah, she gets the clothes as she sits. So.
So we're just drawing to, and I think what you're seeing from the way the artists have beautifully how they discuss their work is that each portrait tells a story. It tells a story of it's the technique, how the artist came to choose the materials, choose the subject, the relationship with the sitter. So it opens up a portrait opens up a whole world, an external world, an internal world as well. And I suppose the question one is left with is what happens to the portraits when we all pass away? Do they? If the sitter is unknown, some famous people might end up in a gallery somewhere, or with the descendants, but where do all the portraits go? That's something I used to wonder about a lot when I worked at the National Portrait Gallery, when I went to the storerooms and saw stacks and stacks of portraits and thought, will these ever see the light of day again? Some will, many won't. And I think we all know from our own sort of, families and experiences, portraits can end up in the attic, they can end up in the cellar. It's something, I find it quite disturbing that there are these presences. There's something uncanny. I think Oscar Wilde captured this in the portrait of Dorian Gray. Once you've created a portrait, you've created this other sort of being, this doppelganger, as it were. And there's something about the portrait that haunts us. I don't know if you have quick thoughts about that, all of you, but quick before we hand over to the audience.
Yeah, I think it's true. They do have a pulse, an energy. They give off. They don't just absorb. They give off something to viewers. But for all that end up in the attic, portraits are unbelievably good survivors. They've got to be on the medals for how they have survived in our consciousness and our awareness and our culture. We have portrait galleries.
Yes. You can't destroy them, can you? You can't destroy them personally.
No, exactly.
Anthony.
I suppose it depends on the portrait, I think, doesn't it, really? Because the sitter as well. The sitter has currency, for future generations. That portrait will survive. It may end up in the National Portrait Gallery or some other similar institution or a national gallery. But if it's a painting of someone who hasn't done anything public life, an ordinary person, so-called ordinary person, I think it depends on the merit of the portrait itself, of the painting. So it has to. So if it's a great painting of an unknown sitter, for instance, I think it will have a life. It will continue. It will survive, and it will go forward. Otherwise, I'm not so sure. It's like any painting, really. So it's not just portraiture; it's all of art.
You think of Larkin, what survival is love. It's all that sort of love which goes into the making of a portraiture.
Yeah.
Something that carries on through, and how it's quite sacrilegious to destroy a portrait. You think of the controversy around the famous Southern portrait of Churchill, which was just destroyed, and we never got over it. Miriam, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a question I've often thought of is why do some paintings survive and others don't? And you like to think that it's the paintings that are ethereally beautiful or have that kind of quality that, so was it Gombrich who said the best critic of art is time? So it's the art that survives through time and fashion that is the really seriously good art, and we'll never know what will survive of our time. I think with portraiture it's slightly more complicated because of the sitter, and as everybody has said, obviously a portrait of an important, eminent person will survive because of that. I think historically it will be either because the sitter will be some monarch, which is the bulk of a lot of the portraiture in our museums, or because the artists themselves have become one of the greats, so therefore anything painted by that artist is worth keeping. But as I say, we don't know. We might have our ideas of what will survive from our time, but we'll have to time travel for that. And sort of, project forward sort of 300 years and see whose works are still on walls. But yeah.
And who used silly paint, which is fugitive.
Exactly.
And their techniques.
Well, I'm sure your works will survive. So we've come to the end of our discussion. I'm sure we could go on forever, but I am certainly mindful of time. And we did want to open the floor to questions, if you had any. We do have a few minutes on spare, if any of you would like to ask questions of the panel.
I know all these three very well.
Do you want to on one of these?
We have to hear you.
I can reflect.
Yes.
I know all three very well, but I don't think I've ever asked you what you think about the relative importance of the hands to the face and the head in terms of actually conveying the person. And I think if you, Francis, you said you thought the hands were absolutely vital to get into the portrait.
Yes.
I was just wondering what your attitude is about hands.
Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
I'll quickly, yeah. No, I absolutely love painting hands, and I get them into my portraits as often as I can. I think just like Francis, I think hands reveal so much about the person. In a sense, they betray sometimes what the true personality of the person. They're elegant, they're architectural. They're actually sometimes almost more interesting than the face, to be honest. So yeah, I think hands are fantastic, and they reveal a lot about the personality and the psychology of the person. Some people hold their hands they guard themselves with their hands. Other people have very open, expressive gestures. So that's all very fascinating to observe. And you always want to let the sitter sit in their natural pose first and see what they reveal before you're tempted to go in and choreograph, which can happen as well. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with everything you just said. So, yeah, the hands, and I agree. Painting hands can be, it's great. I don't always have the opportunity to do that because sometimes I never get down that far. So it's, but when I do paint them, I have the opportunity to paint them. I really enjoy it, and it's like painting another portrait, and it does reveal, it can reveal something psychological about the sitter, especially as you were saying, how they sit, how they. So that's why I do like to initially draw someone, draw them from different perspectives. So just to get an insight and into how they behave, So yeah, it's a great thing. They're really hard to paint sometimes, quite complicated as well. So, and sometimes if I haven't painted hands for a long time, it's harder because you don't do them all the time. So,
No, but it brings you back to basics.
It does,
It's almost I have to get grits with this alien thing. It's doing.
And I got a lot of flack for that painting of the Queen when the hands came in for a lot of criticism, more so than the portrait ahead, which is quite amazing, really. I think it's because I've made them look kind of too large or too puffy or too something. So the hands are very important.
For me, it's sort of almost like it's the sign of, is somebody a great portrait painter? Because there's lots of people who can paint decent heads.
Yeah.
There are very few people who can do the torso and the hands as well and do a really good job. And I always look at the hands first now.
Although it's interesting because historically you get a lot of, so I always refer to Van Dyck hands.
Yeah.
So in Van Dyck's, but I think that was a question of time. So whatever time they had with the sitter would be focused on the face. And you can see that the archetypal hand is just kind of just falling out of the sleeve, looking all very elegant and feminine and doing that. I mean, beautifully painted, but
They were aristocrats.
Yeah. No, but it's the same hand, It might be his wife's hand.
It's not a particular, it's not particular to the sister.
Yeah.
I love Van Dyck's hands.
Yeah.
No, it's a whole field of gesture, I think. So the body, how everything is in, there are little peaks on that map, and the head and the hands, and it could be something else if it's a particular thing of a person's, or even an item of clothing. You don't know what will be exaggerated in advance. You just have to get stuck in.
Question?
Yes, here's another question over here.
Many thanks for the beautiful, informed, insightful and inspiring discussion, which is amazing. I just wonder, if you're doing self-portrait, would you use a mirror photograph, or like Miriam having another colleague doing her portrait? Thank you.
Shall I stop?
Yes.
I do use a mirror, and I use photographs. I've put myself in some uncomfortable positions, and there's just only so much pain one can absorb whilst painting. And so I was sitting cross-legged, and we had a painful time my husband trying to get photos of the angle that I was in. But the mirror, first and foremost, and then photos to sort of help you, because it's a complicated, twisty negotiation, a self-portrait, I found. Have you done a self-portrait?
Yeah, I have, yeah. Actually, when I first started as an artist, obviously I couldn't afford to pay for models. So a self-portrait, that model was always going to be free. So it's a good way of developing your work. And they're quite hard to do, and I always use the mirror. I never use photographs. And it's actually quite hard working from a mirror. And I don't really enjoy it, so I haven't painted a self-portrait for about 10 years. I'm probably due to do another one. I feel as if you should do them occasionally, but it's not something I look forward to. But you can get really, and they can be really quite intense as paintings, because you've that close scrutiny.
If you're copying yourself from a mirror, are you coming up in reverse?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you do.
The strangeness.
So it does. You do have that. So it is like you, and it's not
Yeah.
like you. So, but they can be very. When I look at other artists' self-portraits, sometimes it can be their best work. Actually, if you look at, I was just looking at Freud earlier on, and that's an amazing portrait from the 80s when it's down for about here, and it's so incredible. It's just. You can just sort of raise your level sometimes. So it is a worthwhile thing to do. So,
But it's interesting also, just jumping in a minute, I always find fascinating, like the Rembrandts, or when you go in and see it, because he got broke at the end, but he painted himself all through the generations.
He did.
I don't know about you, I find it so interesting that the artists do that, and you learn so much from it, like you said about Freud, and going there this morning, and the different stages that he painted as a young boy, and then his 20-year-old ones, around about that era. Then you jump to the really full-on naked ones and the boots, it's quite interesting. That was a very good question.
Miriam, did you want to add?
Yes, I've sort of failed on the self-portrait front. I have to say, so I'm obviously a failed portrait artist. I've done one self-portrait and I don't really like it. It's not my best work. I don't find observing myself interesting. I think that's the problem. It's not the methodology of how you get to the painting. I just don't. But it's something that I might have to address because it's obviously part of every portrait artist's portfolio. So at some point I'm going to have to embrace the self-portrait. But I'm not drawn to it at all. And yet, as James has just said, one of my absolute, in my pantheon of gods, as it were, portrait painting gods, is Rembrandt, who his best work is his self-portraits, which are incredible. And just full of psychology and pathos, and I'm not sure I could observe myself. I just don't find myself interesting enough to paint me. I'm really fascinated in other people, but not myself. But anyway, that's my problem.
We'll have to watch this space.
Exactly.
And see what happens.
There's somebody who's got it, the lady in red over here.
Thank you so much for the panel so far. Obviously, so much of your work happens outside of the sitting, and so sitting becomes like that precious commodity for bringing like a lot of that psychology. How do you plan and strategize for the little time that you do have within those sittings?
Shall I start with you?
Yeah. That's a good question. Yeah, because a lot of the time it's just in the studio without the sitter. But I'm yes, especially if I'm working on a background, so I don't need the sitter there for the background, so I can do all that. And I do preparatory studies in pencil or charcoal, and I use those to work from, so to develop the underpainting. So I do quite a lot without the sitter, and so I have a strategy for that really. And then I will get the sitter to come back at some point, because I don't have enough information to carry on without the sitter. So I get them back, and I need that, and then they will go away for another couple of weeks. So sittings can take place over a year sometimes, or 2 years sometimes, you know. So it's a long, extended kind of period to produce a painting, or it can be, for me anyway. So, but I do need the engagement with the sitter all through that process, right up to the end, really. So it's a bit of both, really, working with and without. So that's my kind of procedure, anyway. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important for me to have the first sittings at the very beginning, where there's nothing on the canvas. You're carrying no preconceptions into it. You might have a plan, you might have a dry plan, composition, you know, what you're going to do, but you're going to let that person percolate, chatting away to them, get their mind off what's happening. And in that conversation, you hope for glimpses of what you think of as the character you're going to now chase. And I try to keep that very heavily in mind after I've left them. And because I'm painting them as they are in that mode, you can then have a kind of memory of that expression that you're after. So you then got to hold that in your mind as you go through the project, so I don't take forever. If I leave them for 6 months and come back to them, I often find that that's dripped out, and I have lost the sort of direct memory of what it is I'm after. So the sittings reveal what you're after, and then it's a sort of a job or a challenge often to maintain that crystalline view of what it is you wanted as you work on alone. So it's definitely a major, but you know, I then go and ask them. Yeah, I like talking to them, so they will help me. They work for me.
So I'm going to pass over to Miriam for the final comment, and then we'll probably have to close the session because of time.
Yes, I like to have time with the sitter, as much time as they can give me, and I will spend that drawing them from life, if they can spend that time with me. I will always back up with photographs. I'll take a lot of reference photographs of the sitter. But then if I'm brutally honest, and I love the time spent with the sitter, like Francis, it is that window into their personality. You have really interesting conversations, you get to know them. But for me, actually, painting is a very private, personal thing. So I like to be in my studio developing the painting. That's my favourite phase, because there's a lot, although my work is very realistic, there's a lot of invention in that. So it's not that kind of immediate alla prima, impressionistic, or, you know, there's a lot of invention of the composition, and there's a lot of ideas that come into the work. And I need to be in my bubble to do that, and I like to develop the painting. And occasionally, if I need the sitter back again, then yes, but that doesn't often happen for me, actually. I think probably quite unusually, I only work on one painting at a time, and it takes me months to finish a painting. But it's almost like a relationship. You're in that work, and you're with that work. And I really envy artists that can have various paintings on the go, but I just can't do that somehow. My mind just gets obsessed with the work that I'm on, and I just kind of see that through to the bitter end. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. I think we're going to close this discussion, but I think what it's revealed, and I started off thinking, well, perhaps portraiture was the most conventional of all the genres, and that, you know, artists had to operate within certain sort of new conventions which they'd inherited from artists from the past. But I think what this discussion has opened up, the room for innovation. There's always room, you know, for variety, for difference, and each artist has his or her own distinct way of working. I think you've really sort of brought that out in this new wonderful discussion today, backed by the images. So thank you very much for attending, and I'm sure if you have any questions of the artists, they'll be around for a little bit longer. But otherwise, I am mindful of time, so I think we're going to draw this to a close, and I think James wants to say
Yes.
a few
Would you
words.
please, thank you so much, Miriam and Alison, and thank you so much, Anthony, and wonderful Francis. And I was just sitting here looking at all your faces and people grinning and so interested in it and the smart questions. And I thought of the saying by Friberg over here, in 100 years, are my paintings worthy of me? And all these people are just marvellous artists. You'll see it yourselves. And it's interesting that, their work remains and becomes like living, as you were saying. And it's just a wonderful experience and a wonderful time just to spend with these incredible people. Would you please show your appreciation for them? Thank you so much. I'm going to finish off before you go. We've been helping and supporting the Sick Children's Trust. And there's some wonderful works through talking about new emerging artists and some wonderful artists. In the next room, they're raising money for the Sick Children's Trust, and they're all available through them. There's some wonderful pieces in there at very, very reasonable prices. So thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a sincere privilege to have you here today. Thank you.